Welcome to the Heather Garden in Fort Tryon Park. I'm Ronda Brands, garden designer and horticulturist, and today we're going to take a walk through this beautiful 3-acre oasis, the Heather Garden, in the northern part of Manhattan, high above the Hudson River and across from the Palisades. Let's walk in and see what's in bloom, and we'll also talk about some design principles at play in the garden. The garden is high above the Hudson River with the Palisades across. It's a beautiful spot. I was lucky enough to become involved in this garden when the Fort Tryon Park Trust engaged Lyndon Miller and me to work on the reinvigoration of the garden. So we began that process in 2009 here with this very long bed you see behind this privet hedge. And after a couple of years of working on this, I stayed and worked with the gardeners here at the park, and we began renovating the heather bed. What we're going to do today is look at the garden from up above for a few moments, and then we're going to come down onto the main path. And I wanted to talk about a design principle having to do with these bigger views. How do we make sense out of a very large space? This is 3 acres of garden. Now, whether your garden is big or small, some of the principles we'll talk about today, you can use in your own garden. And for those of you who don't garden but just love to enjoy walking through gardens, you'll be able to look for some of the design principles that we're going to go over. In particular, I'd like to talk about the repeats of color throughout the garden. Repeats don't have to be all the same plant, but sometimes when you have the same color, you can help unify a very large space. And when we look at this long view of the garden, we see a lot of purple right now on June 1st. Salvia, May night, purple spikes. We see some iris that are purple, and as we walk down the path, we're going to find many other colors in that family. So in addition to color repeats, we're going to see some signature plants, plants that really give us a burst of color and excitement at any given time of year. And at this time of year, we're looking at peonies especially, and poppies, and iris, and salvia, and the roses are starting to come into bloom too. So let's take a walk down the path and we'll see what else is going on in the garden. If you do come to visit the garden, and we hope that you will, please wear your mask and stay 6 feet distance from people, and please pay attention to the signs that instruct you to only walk down the path in this direction. Please, because you can see that the path is not quite 6 feet wide, and please don't step into the plant beds. The azaleas were in bloom not too long ago, and you'll see on the left, this azalea is finished. It used to have a white flower, and azaleas do not stop flowering in a graceful manner. The white flowers look brown and kind of ragged, and it's just something that you have to live with because they're so beautiful when they're blooming. It's well worth it, and soon it will just be a mass of green leaves and it will look just fine. In the meantime, we have a lot of other colors to spark our interest, and in this little area we call the triangle, you see these beautiful wooden forms that one of the gardeners here made for us for vines to grow up. And the vines are just getting started. You can see them at the base of these beautiful wooden forms. John Kelly, who's the landscape coordinator, made these. He's a fabulous gardener. He's an artist. You see these allium in bloom. Those are the big purple flowers, the big inflorescences of purple on top of these long flower stems. It looks like they're coming out of the hostas, but they actually have their own foliage, which is down below the hostas. So we're going to see them popping up all over here and there. And you'll notice that there are a number of other plants that I consider kind of exclamation points or surprises in the garden. We're going to look for things like foxglove, and particularly for poppies. It's really an element of surprise, and in a garden that is meant to have kind of a romantic style like this, you want to have that sort of loose feel to the way the plantings mix together. We see on the right that the roses are coming into bloom, and the roses will bloom not only in June. I know we think of June as Rose Month, but many of these are repeat bloomers. They'll continue to bloom throughout the season, and then they really get going again when the cool weather comes in the fall. Just past the roses, you see the bright pink of the foxglove. And again, it's that whimsical quality, that kind of surprise in the garden. Now, if we look to the left, we call this the heather bed because of the heaths and heathers that are planted here. They're low, undulating ribbons of shrubs. The heaths bloom in the winter here for us mostly and into early spring, and the heathers bloom in the late summer and into the fall. Right now they're not blooming, but some of them have colorful foliage, and that adds to the effect in the bed. But you can see that this particular section of the garden, the star of the show would be that wonderful huge mass of Siberian iris, that dark purple. And in front of it, there's another iris, which is kind of a yellow-white combination. That yellow and white is called iris butter and sugar. I love the name of it. At different times of year, different plants are what you might call signature plants, plants that sort of define the garden in that season. We're now looking at the poppies, and you'll see that the very almost papery petals. And what is very interesting about the poppy plant is, this is true of many different types of plants, but I love poppies in particular, is that you've got buds, which are very interesting in their own right. Then you have, of course, the flowers, and then you have these amazing seed pods that are forming. So it's as though you have like 3 different points of interest all on the plant. We also do have California poppies, which are technically annuals, but they self-seed. Now, most of the poppies that you're going to see in the garden are oriental poppies. The botanical name is Papaver orientale. We have quite a few different cultivars, which means different varieties, and so they come in different colors. The geranium are in bloom. These are hardy geranium, and you see that bright pink flower on the left. So again, we're going to look at some repeats of this plant as we head down the path. And again, they help unify the garden and give you that sense that it's one garden, even though it's a diverse mix of plants. There are over 550 different varieties of plants in this 3-acre heather garden. So that's a wonderful diversity for wildlife. It's very important for birds and butterflies and bees, especially, to have that kind of diversity in the garden. The bright yellow flat top flowers are the flowers of yarrow, that's the common name, or achillea, which is the botanical name for that plant. A wonderful aspect of it, not just the really incredibly bright yellow flowers, but also that kind of gray-green foliage that it has. It's kind of wispy, it has a silvery gray aspect to it. So it really contrasts very well with some of the other foliage colors around it. And then you've got a nice conversation between the yellow flowers of the yarrow and the yellow foliage of the heather that are right next to it. They're small because they were planted not terribly long ago, but they're starting to fill in, and eventually they'll meet each other and they'll join this long ribbon of heaths and heathers running all the way through the garden. Now, on the other side of the path, we're going to see probably really the showstopper in the garden this time of year, the peonies. This garden has traditionally featured many different varieties of peonies. When we did the reinvigoration, we added to that collection as well. So you're going to see plants, some of which have been here for many, 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 many years. Peonies are long-lived. It's an old world garden plant, and there's a good reason, because look how gorgeous this is. And just like we saw with the poppies, you can see with the peonies that you've got buds that are really tight still and they haven't opened yet. And then you have some that are almost open, then you have fully open flowers, and you even have some that are past that are starting to form their seed pods. So it's quite a selection of interest on that plant, and the foliage is gorgeous as well. Right behind the peony, you see a dark foliaged plant. It's kind of a brick red color. That's a smoke bush. It's a variety of cotinus. Now, smoke bushes can get very, very large, but the gardeners keep those pruned down to a lower height in keeping with the scale of the garden. But there's something about the dark wine-colored foliage. You see versions of it in some heuchera that we'll see in the garden, which is kind of a brick red color. But these ideas of a red foliage or brick red foliage, kind of like the little black dress of the garden, it goes with everything. It makes everything look nice. One of the reasons for that is that it's strong contrast with so much of the foliage around that is green. Now, on the left side of the path, you see actually some dark colored foliage on a plant that hasn't quite come into bloom yet. It's called penstemon, and it's got green foliage a little bit on the bottom, but the stems are darker color. So even though this plant is not in full bloom right now, it's giving us a lot of interest from the color of the foliage. So we're not just relying on blooms when we're designing the garden, because I want the foliage colors all through the season to be contrasting with each other or working together to create a certain effect. Now, we also have some German iris. We saw some Siberian iris a little bit earlier, but look at how different the flowers are on the German iris, which is right behind that little foxglove. So cute, that little dwarf foxglove. But this German iris has a very showy flower on it. And the German irises tend to bloom usually a little bit before the Siberian, but it looks like we've got all of them going to town right now at the same time. And if we look over to this side of the garden, we see John watering. Thank you, John, because a garden of this type takes a lot of maintenance. It was never designed to be a low maintenance garden. What we did in the reinvigoration is we tried to make it require a little bit less maintenance, because when this garden was first formed, the park had something like 17 gardeners. And now all of northern Manhattan has usually 4 or 5 gardeners. So although we have very few staff, we do have a lot of volunteers, and those volunteers are so important to keeping this garden looking the way it does. On the left, you see a couple of really large groupings of that amazing dark purple salvia. That's Salvia May Night, and it's one of my favorites because the color is so deep and strong. And I love, again, look at the way the foxgloves just pop up wherever they want to. We do plant them in here intentionally, but they'll seed around, and we put them here and there, just designed to come up and merge and mingle with the other plants and create these combinations that are so much fun. But the Salvia May Night, when it's done flowering, the gardeners can cut it back, and then we'll get another repeat of the bloom later in the season. And that can usually happen a couple of times throughout the season. Just past it is the yellow foliage of the Deutzia, and if you saw the tour from last month, you'll remember that the foliage was yellow, but the plant was quite a bit smaller. These are shrubs and they grow quite fast, and they have white blooms on them, which are just past, but you can still see some of the white flowers on that. Now, when we're talking about repeating colors, and we said it doesn't have to be the same plant. If we want to get that yellow again, we look a little further down the bed and we see a yellow Aquilegia or columbine. Aquilegia is the botanical name. And those are the very wispy flowers that are kind of billowing around, blowing in the breeze, looking like their hair is blown back in the breeze. I love the way the petals are recurved, reflexed like that. And look at that poppy that's just blooming right through that group of salvia. Now, when we look at the salvia and the poppy and the Aquilegia together, that's something that I consider like a vignette. It's a small section of the garden where we have a plant combination that we're trying to encourage, something that looks very pleasing. We also have a little blue juniper in front of the salvia, so altogether we've got maybe 3 or 4 plants creating this vignette. Actually, I see just past the Aquilegia on the lower level, we have some bright pink geranium, which I really like also with the Aquilegia. So these are plant combinations that create vignettes in the garden where we might stop and pause and just appreciate that small grouping. And when you're designing your garden, you want to think about vignettes and pleasing combinations that you might use once, or perhaps maybe you'll repeat them in different sections of the garden. Let's say that you like the way a peony and an iris look together. If you repeat it in another section of the garden, you might choose a different kind of iris just to shake it up a little bit. So you can do a lot of things with these plant combinations that you love. But it's nice to think of plants that might be blooming at the same time of year in the garden that you can combine together to create fun color combinations. Now, when you look at the garden as a whole, we talked before about the long view of the garden. It's like putting a whole bunch of these vignettes together in order to create something that looks unified and cohesive. If we look now out to the Hudson River, to the view of the George Washington Bridge, this is such a great view. Back in the day when this garden was planted in the 1930s, they had an amazing view of the Hudson River because these trees weren't all grown so high. Now we have little peaks of the Hudson River through openings in the trees, but this is a great view of the bridge. We see a little bit of the river down below. And we know we're in Manhattan, but it's hard to believe when you're looking at the rest of the garden that we're here in northern Manhattan. Now we're kind of panning over a a favorite section of mine in a way, because this is where your eye gets to have a quiet moment with the hostas that are growing underneath this Siberian elm. There are a lot of rocks just below the soil right here. You can't see them, so you wouldn't know it, but you can't plant a lot. There's not a lot of soil to plant in. But the hostas will grow almost anywhere, and by using different varieties of hostas, it creates a kind of a tapestry effect. Later in the season, we're going to see some nicotiana, or some flowering tobacco, that is going to start popping up through the hostas with white flowers. There are several different types of foxglove in the garden, and this one, the yellow flowered foxglove, is really something that takes off in the garden. It self-seeds, and we never know where it's going to pop up. One of the things that I do sometimes when I'm trying to evaluate what a garden needs is I will look at the path of the garden, and when I squint my eyes, I can see where I might be missing a color that I wish was there, something that I want to add to the garden. So it's a wonderful effect that you can create yourself of this impressionist painting. But a garden is a painting. It's a painting with plants. And once you get a palette that you really like, then you decide where they're going to go, and you're painting with those plants. Poppy season is not terribly long, so you don't want to miss it. And one of the things that we tried to think about in reinvigorating the garden was, how could we keep this garden unified but make it so diverse that you feel like you don't want to miss a single day in the garden because you might miss something that's come into bloom. There's a huge oak leaf hydrangea that's going to be blooming like mad all summer long. You can see it already has formed the flower buds. You can see why it's called an oak leaf hydrangea. At the ground level, we have a beautiful hosta that has really more of a blue-green leaf, so it's quite different from the green leaf of the hydrangea. So we see how greens can play off each other. And right behind the hosta, we can see that the astilbe is just about to bloom. So now we have another thing that we have to be sure we don't miss, and we've got to come back and take a look at that when it blooms. The very large leaves of things like the oak leaf hydrangea and the hosta, it was really important for us to add some of these elements to the garden when we were doing the reinvigoration, because what we had here originally was a lot of fine foliaged plants, things like azaleas, things like the heaths and heathers. And if you have a lot of that fine foliage all together, your eye can't really make sense of it. It looks like one big mass. So what we tried to do was add larger leaves and different color leaves in order to break up some of that fine foliage. So as we're walking through the garden, see if you can kind of note the different textures of the plants, the different textures of the leaves, the shapes, the sizes, the colors of green or green-blue or silver blue. Siberian iris have a pretty long bloom time, and then the nice thing is that in the fall, the foliage turns really a beautiful kind of, first kind of a yellow and an orange, kind of a yellowy orange. This interesting pink flower is called astrantia, and it really has a long season of bloom and a wonderful, interesting flower that I think dries quite well. Here we have a baptisia. Baptisia is, I think, just coming into bloom. It looks like the buds are just about to open. We also have another one a little further down in the bed. I'm not sure if it's open yet, which is yellow. This stretch of the garden is a little quieter right here in the heather bed because we've got a big stand of heathers here that will come into bloom in the middle of the summer. You can see the woody stems of these plants showing. They're quite old, and there were times in the garden when there weren't enough staff here to prune them when they needed it, so they don't keep a compact habit. Hopefully it will have a few years left in its life. We really want to keep the heath and heather collection here strong. It's one of the biggest collections of heaths and heathers in the Northeast, so it's important that we have many different varieties of heath and heather. But this time of year, they're just a quiet green, a place for the eye to rest. I love these white oriental poppies. On the right side of the path, we've got peonies, and behind them, the allium is just finishing flowering. But as it forms its seed head, it still looks fantastic, even when it doesn't have the color of the flower. So it has a long season of interest. And that reminds us again that we're not looking just for flowers for interest. We're looking for things like seed pods and for foliage and other things in the garden. On the other side of the path, we've got this single plant of this bright red poppy. I don't remember planting it there, and I absolutely love that it's there because there's really no other plant like it in the garden, I don't think. And here it is all by itself, just showing itself off. Looking at the long view down the path, again, we see how important right now, this time of year, the blues and the purples are. It's not the same plant that we're looking at. In the foreground, we see the purple Salvia May Night that we saw earlier. And then a little further down the path, we see a slightly lighter color of a blue purple, and that is from Nepeta Walker's Low. It's a type of catmint. These are plants that the bees love, so it's important that we attract the pollinators to the garden. I love the red foliage of the heuchera underneath this rose. Even though it's not in bloom yet, that really deep color of the heuchera, or coral bells, makes this area showy even without a flower. But can you see that one little rose peeking out? In the back of this bed, you see a huge, what looks like a shrub, and it has inflorescences on the top that look like they're going to turn white. They're just starting to open. This is called Persicaria polymorpha. That's the botanical name. The common name is giant fleece flower. It's actually a perennial. Can you believe it? Which means that about a month ago, it was barely peeking out of the ground, and it puts on all of this growth in this much time. It's huge. And then the flowers, when they really open up, are going to be a very stunning, all white all over the top of this plant, and it will bloom for quite a long season. These beautiful little roses are one of my favorites. It's Rosa Pearl d'Or. It's an 1884 rose. Not that it was planted in 1884, but it was probably hybridized in 1884. So it's an old world rose. You'll notice that at the foot of the rose, some little white plants have just been planted. Those are annuals, meaning that they are planted every year. We don't plant a lot of those in this garden because annuals are labor intensive and they require more water, so we try to keep them to a minimum. Can you hear the cardinal? This is a very important stop on the migratory path for many birds, and we try to encourage that with the plantings. On the left of the path, we see fairly bright pink dianthus, which is like a little mini carnation. As the season progresses, you're going to notice, particularly in the heather bed, the colors are going to get brighter and brighter. Now, when we really get into summer, the heather bed is going to be hot colors. We were looking before at vignettes in the garden, and here's an example of a vignette, a combination of plants put together for a certain purpose. We've got the rose blooming. We have a contrasting foliage in that blue color of the hosta leaf in front of it. Then we have the contrast again of the brick red of the heuchera, or the coral bells, in the foreground. And the coral bells are blooming right now. You can see the flowerscape on it. It's kind of subtle. They're so pretty, and they create yet another element in the garden that will come and go. So it's very fluid the way these vignettes work. And you also notice just past the heuchera, you see some foliage that has green with some little white spots on it. That's pulmonaria. That was blooming about a month ago here in the garden with these pretty little blue flowers on it. So part of the purpose of putting these plant vignettes together is to extend your season of bloom so that you have something blooming in the spring, something blooming in the summer, something in the fall, and that's why certain plants are prized for being what we might call four-season plants, like the oak leaf hydrangea. It looks good in all 4 seasons. Another thing about vignettes is that when you suddenly turn and you see a surprise, there's some allium popping out amongst the hosta, and you couldn't really see it until we got to it. So that gives us a really different perspective than when we're looking down the path. And that's what we were talking about before in terms of design, is thinking about both of those aspects of your garden. What does it look like from the long view, and what does it look like up close when you look straight into the bed? Another design element when we're looking at the long view of the garden is the scale of the plants. It doesn't have to be that all of the lower plants are in the front of the garden. We can really mix that up a little bit, sometimes put some taller plants towards the path. The designers also were thinking about that long view when they made that path curved. The path we're about to walk down now is curved so that you can't always see the whole view and you wonder what's up ahead. On the right side of the path, we see more of that nepeta or catmint, and that's been a repeat in every one of these beds. We've seen some in what we call the perennial bed on one side of the path, in the heather bed, and over here on Allison's Walk on the right side of the path as well. It's a hardy plant, it's tough as nails. The plant coming up by the lamppost is Amsonia hubrichtii, that's the botanical name. Blue star is the common name of this plant, and this is one of those plants that looks amazing in the spring, and then it's going to look really great all summer and then amazing in the fall again. Right now we have the wispy green foliage. Look at the texture of the foliage. It's so different from what we've seen on any other plant. So it really provides contrast to almost anything that you plant near it. Now that foliage in the fall is going to turn the most incredible color of orange with kind of yellow mixed in, really vibrant color in the fall. So that gives us several seasons of interest. The last time we walked through the garden, we noted how structural this plant is. It's a cotoneaster, and it works particularly well on slopes, holds soil in place, but it also has that nice cascading effect, a contrast to what's around it. A little more of that Amsonia hubrichtii. In a garden this big, it's nice to have repeats of these elements, and that Amsonia really needs to be planted in pretty big groupings for it to show up. We're coming into a very different topography here. You're starting to see the rocks on the slope. This garden is built on sloped ground, and as it becomes very rocky, we're going to see the plant palette change. We're going to see plants that don't mind growing in leaner soil and along rocks. When we look up at that old yew, and in our last tour we were talking about how the yews create such a terrific dark green backdrop to the different plants that are going to come in and out of bloom. Earlier in the year we saw azaleas blooming here in front of this yew. Now we see the iris are really making a show. We've got the light yellow of the foxglove and also the light yellow of the Carolina moonlight baptisia on the far left there. And then on the right we've got the foxgloves, which are so happy just popping up here and there, a big nice grouping of them. In a previous renovation, they had uncovered this rock slope and they started planting in the crevices. So today we continue to keep planting really interesting things in the crevices of the rock that will give us colorful foliage, like some of the sedum here on the rock is still yellow. And we've got some little geraniums, xanthus, things that we would not be able to plant in other parts of the garden because they'd be too small. Now I love this little stretch where you can just see the bright pink of the phlox has finished. It's coming cascading down the rocks. And to the right of that, the strappy foliage of the yellow Hakanakloa grass. And we have some foxglove here. And just starting to bloom right at the bottom of this river is a fantastic plant called Allium millennium. It blooms for a long season. And you can see what a wonderful contrast that foliage is to almost everything else in the garden. At the top of the hill, that terrific columbine, the Aquilegia chrysantha that we had mentioned before. You can think of some other columbines you might be familiar with where you practically have to lie on the ground to see the flowers. It's really nice to plant columbines or Aquilegias on slopes so that you can appreciate the flowers a little bit when you're standing down below. That's a terrific grouping of lamb's ears or Stachys byzantina on the top of the hill. Now you never know what can grow out of these little crevices. A lot of plants are designed to do that, and hostas are known for being able to grow in almost no soil, but you see this hosta growing out of this hole in the rock where there's almost no soil at all. And those of you who were on the tour when we walked through last time, remember we planted it, it had about 4 leaves on it. It was teeny tiny, we weren't sure it was going to survive. And here it is. I've named it Owen. It's doing very well. So later in the season, we'll see if it puts up a little flower. Well, that concludes our tour for today. Thank you for walking through the garden with me. I wish we could be together in person, so I hope that will happen someday soon. The Fort Tryon Park Trust is the organization that works closely with the Parks Department to help keep this park going. and to really focus on Fort Tryon Park and what it can offer the public. Includes over 300 free programs per year, and we do that meeting here, but right now we're doing as much of it as possible virtually and keeping this garden going for everyone to enjoy. It's a public park, it's open to everyone, so I hope that if you have the means, you might consider donating to the Fort Tryon Park Trust, forttryonparktrust.org, and you'll find so many resources there about the plants that are in bloom here in different months of the garden, pictures of the garden, and soon there will be more photos of individual flowers identifying the plants in the garden too. So we hope you've enjoyed the walk, and hopefully you'll join us next time. Thank you.